And this next session plays really well into it. Moving on to the penultimate session of the day, a leader's discussion on AI and cloud, a perfect merger for data-driven innovation. Please join me in welcoming our speakers, Srikrishna, CEO and Executive Director, Hexaware, Vishal Lall, Chief Operating Officer, HPE Aruba, and HPE Pathfinder Ventures. And our chair for the session, Matt Eastwood, SVP Enterprise Infrastructure, Cloud Developers and Alliances, IDC. Matt manages a team of analysts researching process, people, and technology trends, and also draws upon his experiences as an environmental engineer to actively involve himself in IDC's corporate and social responsibility and technology for social good. That's a research initiative. Over to you, Matt. This stage is all yours.
Thank you, Shreya. In today's session, we're going to be really talking about AI and cloud and how the combination of the two around data-driven innovation are super important to how we would think about the transformational needs of the marketplace. So my name is Matt Eastwood, and I'm with IDC, and I lead our research around enterprise infrastructure, cloud developers, and also partnering. And I'm pleased to be joined today by Srikrishna, who we're going to call Keech, from Hexaware, and Vishal Lall from HPE. He's specifically with HPE Aruba. And before we go into a back and forth Q&A kind of discussion with the three of us, I'm just going to make a couple of opening comments to get everybody kind of in sync with what we're thinking about here. So when we think about this, we're having a discussion about a number of kind of high-level topics around digital transformation specifically and what we saw in 2020 and remaining into 2021 in relationship to the pandemic. Over the past year, we saw organizations accelerate their digital transformation out of necessity and really with no warning at all. The leaders that were not believers in the importance of digital technologies as a cornerstone to their business really saw a lot of damage done to their businesses. The technology headline of the pandemic was really the role that technology played. And for organizations without a digital presence, they failed to be present in a world where physical locations were shuttered. And we also saw organizations that didn't have a proper investment in either cloud, collaboration, communications technologies. They failed to be productive. And I would add to that and just say organizations without investments in data intelligence technologies were really unable to respond and react to what was happening in the market in real time and created a lot of challenges for themselves. So I think a lot of awareness was raised as we went through this pandemic. When we set this conversation up, we also just like to point out a couple of key market indicators that are important to how we think about all this. We expect that cloud investments will remain very strong throughout 2021. We see hybrid cloud adoption has roughly doubled in the last 12 months, and that's mainly due to advances in things like management tools and governance capabilities. But it's important to note that when we think of cloud, we think of cloud as an IT operating model and not necessarily a destination. At this point, we also see about 50% of all organizations using SaaS applications or plan to use SaaS over the next 12 months, and we expect that trend will also accelerate on top of what we see with cloud as an infrastructure domain and also platform. 5G is very important here as well. It's part of the investment that's really sustained in the downturn, and this extends to both the consumer as well as the enterprise. Going forward, we believe that cloud-native applications, edge, and also automation are going to play a very big role in IT decision-making. We think that 5G will really sit squarely in the middle of a conversation that's spanning not only the IT landscape, but also what's happening with operational technologies that begin to get quite industry-specific, and also communications technologies, whether that's from a carrier or it could be a cloud service provider. And as an example, by 2022, we think that 90% of enterprises will still be looking for that killer 5G application due to some continued limited integration with tangential technologies and a meaningful ROI. But having said that, about 75% of enterprises in industries like manufacturing, logistics, mining, et cetera, will begin to adopt private 5G networks to achieve network reliability, coverage, and maintain data control, security, and sovereignty. So lots of interesting things happening. I think about an infrastructure that's stretching and expanding. When we start to think about core and the role of cloud and also edge. And then I also think about massive growth in the number of applications we have to manage, the interdependencies of those applications, and that leads to a conversation around how do we apply more intelligence to the infrastructure, to the applications, and also to how we manage our IT, because scale is going to become a big consideration for a lot of organizations. So I'll pause there, and I'm going to bring both Vishal and Keech into the conversation. And I'd like to start first by asking Vishal if you could provide a little bit of context around how the pandemic has really changed the workplace and how that is expected to continue to change going forward, and also the role that technology is playing in enabling the changes that we see in the workplace.
Thanks, Matt. In terms of the trends that we are seeing, that is very consistent with what you just mentioned. And digital transformation really has been the big umbrella under which a lot of changes have started to happen. And the way I think about it is, a lot of these trends were already starting to unfold. And what the pandemic did was really accelerate their deployment across enterprises, right? So whether you think of cloud adoption, right? I think people started looking at scalability, elasticity of cloud and say, hey, you know what? It's easier for me to provision infrastructure, expand workloads, and they've been down that path, right? Whether it's automation or AI, companies were already down that path, but they started accelerating either from a customer experience perspective or from a cost perspective, right? Kind of automation perspective. So we saw that edge processing started expanding as well, as more people are in a distributed environment now and are going to be in a distributed environment. So we are starting to see more of that. And then the interesting thing, and I know we may get into this more later, is how the network architecture is starting to evolve now. So as the infrastructure is getting to be more distributed, the network architecture has to respond and to support that distributed environment, right? So that's kind of another change that has started to happen and is starting to accelerate. And then the last one I would say is even more important. I know it's been important for the last 25, 30 years, but it's cybersecurity. As more and more employees are working outside of the corporate firewall, they are more prone to cyber dangers. So cybersecurity started to become more and more important. I said, kind of if you think about these elements of digital transformation, they've all started accelerating. There's one other area that's been very interesting, and I think as we look at the next 3 to 5 years, you'll see more and more of that. And that's this concept of hybrid workplace, like you just mentioned earlier as well. And as we look at the next year to 2 years and 3 years, as we start coming back from the office, more and more number of employees will work from a combination of an office location and a remote location, right? And when we come back from the pandemic, I think that experience that we've had over the last 12 months isn't going to change, right? So even when offices open up, we'll have employees who come into the office a few days a week, will work from home a few days a week. And this is a new trend that wasn't really present before the pandemic. And I think as we go forward, it will be meaningful, right? And this new hybrid workplace environment will just be an important element of how we work. And we as technology leaders have to figure out how to support that from a technology perspective. And it takes a whole bunch of technology, architecture, and tools to come together. For example, if you are working from home as a corporate employee, there is an element of taking your network home. Which what I mean by that is the policies that you have, the access to information that you have, the security that you have, the ability to collaborate with your coworkers, right? How do you make sure that every single employee has the ability to work from home in such a way that is seamless to them? That's just one example, right? If you think about a distributed network, now all of a sudden, it's not just the LAN that matters, right? Because employees typically sat within the local area network. but there is this new WAN that is going to come into being, right? And it's different from the wide area network that existed, which connected retail or remote locations into a central office. Think of, if there's a company, think of a big bank that has 300,000 or 400,000 employees. We have to think about every single employee's home location as a remote branch, right? So all of a sudden now you're looking at a corporate network that has 500,000 locations connecting back into the cloud, being able to scale, being able to provide security, being able to provide the policies associated with what employees need to access information, etc. So again, a whole bunch of changes coming, but this is a new concept, and at least we are seeing a huge expansion and a request from our customers around this particular area. I'll pass it back to you, Matt, with that.
Perfect. That was great, Vishal. And I think when we first started at IDC thinking about this pandemic, one of the things we landed on was this term next normal, because a lot of people are calling about the new normal, but essentially I think you're absolutely right. The world will be hybrid. We're going to take a lot out of what we've been through this past year. We're going to carry that forward. And I think there's one thing in what you said that's really interesting and applies to the conversation that you and Keech and I were having just yesterday to prepare for that. And that's when you start to think about how the network's evolving, and we're moving from a world where we really thought about human scale to a world that's really about cloud scale. Keech, I thought it'd be great to kind of get your perspective on how people haven't necessarily thought about network first, and that's really what Vishal's touching on here when they think about cloud. And curious if you could just provide a little bit of perspective about the role that you think cloud will play both in network and in security.
Yeah, and the point Vishal made about having 500,000 homes as branches, and how do you kind of connect and secure them. And if you think about what happened in the early days in pandemic, this was real. We had two types of clients. We had clients who had network and VPN architectures that will VPN from our employees' homes to their nearest branch office, and then backhaul everybody into the corporate network. That doesn't work, because those were built for maybe 5% or 10% employees on an emergency or some basis to VPN into that location. So there's zero chance that they could move to work from home. Now, if you had implemented a cloud-based VPN, then it's a completely different architecture. Now, and we had clients who were attempting to force everybody through that corporate WAN network, who realized within 48, 72 hours that this is not going to work, and had to move to a cloud-based VPN architecture that we provided for them. So, all the aspects that Vishal spoke about, cloud, security, network, and the pandemic working ways, all came together in these examples. And, security, you really have to think in that world of as nobody is in the trusted zone. Every device is untrusted. I think that's a good start point to how to think about security in that world.
One thing that I think fits nicely in this kind of part of the conversation is one of the things we've been talking a lot about too is where we end, post-pandemic is a world where a lot of users are going to try to achieve what we call digital parity. So to kind of build on what both Vishal and Keech, what you were saying, essentially we're living in this hybrid world where people are going to work differently from multiple locations, including even if you're in the same building. I think we'll be using these digital tools much differently than we did in the past, and we're much more aware about creating more of a level and even kind of playing field for everyone. Where I know I used to work in an office, and we used to have a lot of our coworkers dial in for meetings, and it wasn't always fair because they were listening to us rustle with our chips and eating our sandwiches during meetings, and it's going to be very different going forward. I think we're much more aware of what a quality experience is digitally. So I thought maybe to just kind of keep this conversation going, Vishal, I could come back to you and talk just a little bit more about Edge, and specifically how the architecture is continuing to evolve to support the processing of data at the edge. So maybe a few thoughts there, how the applications are chasing the data and the infrastructure needs to be there to support both.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Matt. And kind of like, there's another area that we've seen grow over the last year, right, with the pandemic. And really kind of the way we think about the edge architecture is the four elements to it. right? I mean, the underlying thesis of the edge is that it's going to be very distributed, right? Very different from a large data center where it's consolidated in one place. It's going to be a very distributed environment where infrastructure, whether it's processing or storage or security devices or network devices, they are all over the world, right? And so the very first element associated with the architecture is connectivity, right? I mean, unless you have robust connectivity, you just can't do anything with an edge architecture. And then connectivity is, and kind of the way we think about it is multi-protocol, right? It's not Ethernet, it's not 5G, it's not Bluetooth, it's not Wi-Fi. It's a combination of these things, right? And think of IoT devices, right? A lot of them will be connected via protocols like Bluetooth, by LoRa, etc., right? So that distributed environment needs to be connected, and connectivity is kind of like the paradigm, the kind of the important underlying principle behind it. The second is around management, right? If you have a fleet of devices across the world, how do you manage it, right? And you have to manage it from a cloud environment where you can scale and manage these devices on an ongoing basis. The third is specifically around the infrastructure. It has to be autonomous. And what I mean by that is, a lot of what we are seeing in the edge is there's going to be edge to cloud connectivity. In certain cases, there won't be connectivity, or there'll be intermittent connectivity. So these environments, they need to be autonomous. And if the connectivity goes down, they need to still operate, right? Because in many cases, what happens is edge processing is revenue generating, right? Think of a factory, right? And kind of an assembly line in the factory. If that goes down, you're directly impacting revenues, right? Think of fast food store, right? Think of that as a micro factory. And if the connectivity to the cloud goes down, you're again impacting revenue directly, right? So these edge locations or edge infrastructure platforms need to be autonomous, and they're driven by data, right? So they're very data heavy. And so elements of machine learning, elements of AI come into play. And the whole life cycle of acquisition of data, analytics associated with data, and then acting on the data is important, right? And then I think the fourth element, I think we just spoke about that as well, is security. And very similar to what Keith said, it starts with visibility, right? Because especially on the network with IoT devices, with user devices, with things, right? You just need to understand, kind of, first of all, identify the devices. So it's visibility of the devices, it's understanding what they are and categorizing them, and then lastly, protecting them. So the way we kind of think about, kind of just to summarize this, right, these are the four elements that come together to create the full architecture at the edge. It's connectivity, it's management of a distributed footprint, it's an infrastructure that's autonomous, and fourthly, the security associated with this.
That's, I think, again, that fits extremely well with what we see and what we're thinking about as well. I think everybody's aware of kind of what's gone on with data growth, and what we're essentially saying is we're seeing the applications move to where that data is being created, which is increasingly in these edge locations. I don't think everybody's really as aware of what we see in terms of application growth. We actually think that the number of applications in the install base was roughly going to double just in the next 4 years. So it's just a massive amount of load that's coming at us. And I couldn't agree more when I start to think about the importance of intelligence and autonomy and all of this. And then just one last notion on these applications is the number of interdependencies between these applications is rising as well. And that's a big consideration for where people land their applications and how they think about managing them and securing them. So I think maybe from here, we can take the conversation forward specifically around AI, and I'll start with you, Keech, but if we could talk just a little bit about some examples of AI deployments that have accelerated specifically because of COVID, and then we can kind of bat that around a little bit.
Yeah. And before I talk examples of code, right? I mean, we're talking about AI and cloud. I mean, to me, they're inseparable. Right? You ask a room full of data scientists, would you rather have some data and some really good, algorithms, or would you have lots of data and moderate algorithm? I think virtually everybody in the room is going to pick the latter. They're going to say, give me moderate or even poor algorithms and lots of data to work with that I can train. Now, if you think about this, how many organizations can afford to do that, but for the cloud, If the goal is to use as much data as you can to train and even self-train algorithms on an ongoing basis, it has to be based on the cloud. So there's just very few companies in the world can afford the computing power. So really, computing power, ubiquitous, cheap, data, and smart algorithms, the three of them naturally live in the cloud. So I think cloud is the start point for AI, and to me, it's an inseparable kind of thing. AI is always interesting, but in pandemic, has exposed some really interesting situations where, we've spoken about automation and AI displacing humans, but, some examples, interesting places where it's happened. In Hexaware, we were piloting using a HR bot, through 2019 and first part of 2020. By April, we deployed it to 20,000 employees worldwide within a month. And because for us, suddenly that became the only HR. HR job is to talk to people, meet them, walk the floors, and there's no people that can do it. And now we have a chatbot that does it and produces a daily report saying, here are your 4 people that you should talk to in your team because they are unhappy or they're at risk. We've deployed also technology, and this is something which you're seeing of great interest with clients, to assess and catch risks in mental health of employees. That's a clear risk with people working in a lockdown and extended time working from home. So, those are, some examples of AI that I think has come about because of the pandemic.
Perfect. So, Vishal, do you have anything you'd like to add in terms of use cases that you see emerging either inside of IT, it could be in the business, as Keech was talking about?
Yeah, I think we are a product company, Matt, as you know, right? So I can give you a good examples of how we are using it from a product perspective, right? And a lot of it is, as I mentioned earlier, is smart experience, right? And some of it is around cost as well. And I mean, kind of the way we think about AI is AI insight, right? So every product that we make, every process that we run has some elements of that, right? And kind of the way we picked up AI, whether it's in the edge or the data center, we are applying AI to both our products in both the space. And it's mostly around, it's somewhat about automation. It's elimination of manual tasks, right? It's resolution of network issues, for example, on the edge. We've been able to reduce it by 90% in certain cases, right? We've been able, kind of on the edge, we've been able to expand network capacity, right? So those are all examples of the types of things that we've been able to do just by working off data. And, to the point Keech made, what we've been doing is we've been collecting data from, millions of devices, for example, on the edge that we are managing, and that helps us just improve the overall network performance. Helps us solve issues before they show up, for example, right? And then on the data center as well, I mean, we have this product called HP InfoSight, which we've had for close to a decade now. But again, it's self-learning, is improving as we go along. And that particular product is collecting over 90,000 data points every 4 seconds, right? It's got petabytes, many petabytes of data that, it sits in a database. And it helps resolve storage incidents, for example, before they occur. And based on kind of the analysis we've done, we can resolve 90% of issues before they even occur. So those are the types of things that we are doing by leveraging AI, just improving the experience that our customers have and just making these products much more autonomous, right? So that they can just run by themselves.
Perfect. And I think we've got time maybe for one last round here. When I think about this entire conversation that we've had, I think a lot about the ecosystem that we all participate in, this big IT ecosystem and how it's changing. And certainly, for example, we expect that in the next few years, half of the global Global 500 is going to actually start to build and sell SaaS apps that are maybe industry specific, but you're going to see more and more innovation happening in businesses and you're going to see more entanglement of what we would think of IT supply and IT buyer kind of happening. So I think it's really, really fascinating times for our industry. I couldn't agree more that AI and cloud is going to be at the center of all of this. So maybe one good question to just leave both of you with is there anything that we've left out here that you think we should address and kind of introduce in this conversation as we close it out? And I'll start with Keech, and then I'll go to you, Vishal.
Yeah, I think talent. If I think of what does it take to make all of this happen, and what is that short supply? Even at the height of the pandemic, height of panic in April last year, if you look at U.S. unemployment figures, unemployment was at 15%, but tech unemployment was still in the 2%. And so I think, and that cannot be wasted away, and we're not going to create, there's not enough talent for anyone to hire. Every single organization, service providers like us have invested for decades in talent creation, but I think everybody needs to do it. Every customer needs to think of talent in a more sustainable way, and that's what is going to ultimately help, transform some of this potential to reality.
That's right. Vishal, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, Matt, the way kind of I would answer that is, I think we spoke about a whole bunch of trends, right? I think talent, Keech's point is very important. But kind of as we go forward, right, if you look at the next 3-4 years, we'll see a very significant change in the technology landscape, right? And some of it, I think, has been driven by what's happened over the last 12 months. I think people have realized that the world can be different and we can sustain differently, right? And so a whole bunch of these trends that we talked about, we'll start seeing more and more of them. I completely agree with you on the industry-specific applications, right? I mean, the world so far has been very horizontal, right? If you look at it from an infrastructure platform perspective, even from an application perspective, right? I mean, everything that large tech companies do have been very, very horizontal that cuts across, right? Yes, there have been industry-specific applications, especially I can think of, areas like healthcare, etc. But that's where a lot of the innovation will come, especially with cloud and AI, fueling that innovation. So I agree with you. If you look at the next 3 to 5 years, that's kind of where a lot of the investments will go, a lot of the value creation will happen, and a lot of the impact to society will happen.
Perfect. I think that's a great place to bring this to a close. So I'd like to thank both of you, Srikrishna or Keech, and also Vishal. Thanks for joining, for working with me on this, and I want to wish all the NASScom attendees the best in the days and months ahead. Enjoy the rest of the show. Thanks very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, Srikrishna, and Vishal. What really makes the perfect recipe for crucial long-term success? That conversation raises some poignant questions, and speaking about the innovation multiplier effect, that's a sure vision to help companies reimagine business models, speed up digital transformation, and meet and fulfill business objectives. Cloud, data, and AI, clearly the magic mantras for reimagine business and long-term success.